Good evening, Ghanshyam sir. Good evening, everyone. Today at this 85th Sunday Sahityik Satsang, I would like to invite Professor Anupama Ora, President of iSPELL, to introduce the event coordinator, Dr. Somali Saha. Please, ma'am.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pramod Dhangle. Welcome to all present on this virtual platform and also on the YouTube for this Sunday Sahityik Satsang, which is an academic endeavor introduced by a few like-minded academicians during the very crucial time of pandemic, the first wave of pandemic 19, the COVID-19. And for the month of May, the event coordinator is Madam Saha. And it's a pleasure to introduce such a vibrant, visionary iSPELLian. To give all the members present here a brief introduction about the event coordinator, Dr. Somali Saha has a teaching and research experience of more than 14 years. And she has presented many papers in national and international conferences and seminars, and has also edited 2 books. One is Empowerment of Tribal Women, and the other is Northeast India, a Cultural Revaluation. Besides her teaching and research, her area of specialization, as we all know, is Dalit literature. And in addition to her research, she is also the coordinator of the placement cell of Women's College and has organized many workshops and awareness programs on career development and personality development for the students of her college. And she is also the Vice President of Indian Society for the Promotion of English Language and Literature, Tripura Forum. And this forum is one of the vibrant forums we have of the iSPELL Association. And with these words, I welcome her and hand over the proceedings to her to introduce the chairperson, the speakers, and the master of ceremonies as the event proceeds further. Thank you. Over to you, Dr. Somali.
Dr. Somali, ma'am.
Hello.
Yes, ma'am. Now you are audible.
Okay. Am I audible and visible?
You are not visible, but audible.
Hello.
Yes, now visible. Please start.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. Respected resource person, chairperson, and master of ceremonies of the day. Respected founder, director, and general secretary of iSPELL India, president of iSPELL India, vice presidents, IT coordinator, all the EC members, the members of different forums of iSPELL, and the learned participants joining us through Zoom platform and YouTube live stream. A hearty welcome to you all in the 85th Sunday Sahityak Satsang of iSPELL. In its journey to elevate the fraternity, Indian Society for the Promotion of English Language and Literature is presenting the continuous spell of satsangs on every Sundays since 5th September 2020. To reach the unreached, iSPELL is stretching its wings to various parts of the country. iSPELL Tripura Forum, one among the 8 wings of iSPELL India, has taken the amazing initiative to conduct the satsangs of the month of May on the theme Partition Memory Through History and Literature. Dr. Pallavi Chakravarti sir, the Vice President of iSPELL India, as well as a very committed teacher from Tripura, has meticulously designed all the events of this theme-based month. And I find myself blessed and fortunate to have the opportunity to coordinate the events on behalf of Tripura Forum. Partition in India is still one of the darkest periods in the history of Indian subcontinent, which has left indelible marks on the pages of Indian history and literature. This division shaped, reshaped, and sometimes twisted millions of lives and identities, leaving traumatic legacies in its wake. Memory of partition pains our mind, aches our heart, and touches our soul. It has been 75 years that India is drinking the sweet nectar of freedom from the foreign yoke of British colonial rule, but had paid a heavy compensation in the form of partition, which till today continues to tantalize historians, haunt the Indian psyche, and cast its shadow on our social and political life. But among all the dreadful consequences of partition, there are still certain things for our consolation. It was true that 2 nations were rendered apart by bitterness, yet they remained conjoined by memory, language, literature, and tradition. The partition failed to destroy the language of the people, hence, literature was not partitioned and will never be. When history presents the facts and figures of partition, literature explores the feelings, emotions, and sentiments of the people involved in the event directly or indirectly. The tragedy of partition gave rise to a new literary genre called partition literature, which presents a nuanced depiction of this tragedy. Laments and memoirs related to partition were written and are being written in many tongues. But the selection here is from both the sides of the borders to understand the varied tinges of the partition episode. On the 75th anniversary of partition, iSPELL, which keeps profuse faith on the enormous power of literature, is bringing for you a bouquet of lectures to commemorate the event by reliving the memories handed down to us through history and literature. As we all know, women, who remained the most vulnerable victims of partition, suffered all sorts of humiliation, violence, torture, and barbarism, which subsequently came into focus through historical documents and pieces of literature. Today's keynote speaker, Dr. Pallavi Chakravarti, will enlighten us on the topic Partition Traumatic Memories, an East-West story of the refugee woman. To proceed further, today we are having with us Dr. Neetu Kumari Gupta as the Master of Ceremonies, who will take us along with her towards this aesthetic journey of Sunday Sahityak Satsang. Now let me take the opportunity to introduce Dr. Gupta to the learned audience. Dr. Neetu Kumari Gupta is an assistant professor who teaches in the Department of English, Nagaon Girls College, Assam. She has specialized in life writing. Her areas of interest include gender studies, comparative literature, and critical theory. She has completed a UGC-sponsored minor research project on women's writing in the year 2015. She has an experience of 15 years of teaching in higher education and has presented papers in various national and international conferences along with several publications. So Neetu ma'am, the platform is up to you ma'am. Please proceed. Neetu ma'am, over to you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Somali ma'am. Thank you so much. Am I audible?
Yes, ma'am, you are audible.
Okay. Very warm greetings to all of you. And I welcome to the 85th Sunday Sahityak Satsang. On this day of labor and holiday, that is May the 1st, 2022. Under this iSPELL acronym, Indian Society for the Promotion of Indian Language and Literature. This society has both raised to become one of the most potential platforms that has positively inclined us to regenerate and propagate insightful expertise on various topics. And for the purpose, I mean, most of us, we will be familiar that the iSPELL, it has so designed its structure that it devotes every month to one particular issue or topic. And for this month, I mean, the month of May, the 1st of May that we began, I mean, we will start off with the sessions. 1st of May, where, I mean, most of the Indian states are getting hotter, which is already informed before the session, most of the teachers were discussing. But I believe that this, I mean, the session today will obviously, I mean, for sure refresh our minds and divert our minds from the temperature that is outside, and will also enlighten us with the thoughtful ideas that the speaker and the chairperson would be sharing with us today. And apart from this, I mean, as I have already said, that every month iSPELL, the forum, decides and takes up one specific area of study and a critical observation. For this month of May, the society has selected partition memory through history and literature. As Sumali ma'am has already said so much about, I mean, the basic outline about the partition literature and how it has, influenced, has transformed people's life, and how it is still influencing. And that part of the history is both traumatic. At the same time, we most of, being children, we were having the picture of the glorifying picture of the independence when we had freedom and the years of progress and liberty. But now through these writings, we will look into other aspects, how this partition, one particular political decision, has brought about so much change in the lives of thousands of people in the East and the West, Pakistan, not just that, the entire country and the world as well. For this topic that we have chosen for the month of May, partition memory through history and literature, aligning with this topic, today we have with us Dr. Pallavi Chakravarti, Assistant Professor of History, School of Liberal Studies, Ambedkar University, Delhi. Chakravarti ma'am, she has specialized in modern Indian history and has doctoral thesis looked at rehabilitation of refugees coming into post-partition India from West and East Pakistan respectively, from a comparative perspective through which she will be able to, or she will try to demonstrate the fault lines of the rehabilitation policies of the government of India. Her areas of interest include partition studies, forced migration studies, and gender studies. Her doctoral thesis is under publication with Primus Books. The title, Boundaries and Belongings, Rehabilitating the Refugee, an East-West Story. She has presented papers on themes involving partition, refugees, gender conflict, and the archives in national and international conferences, and some of them have been published in peer-reviewed journals. So without much ado, for the session to begin, I now welcome Dr. Pallavi Chakravarti, resource person for today's session, to sound her paper and put up her ideas for today. Over to you, ma'am. Pallavi Chakravarti, ma'am.
So thank you, Dr. Gupta, and thank you to iSPELL for giving me an opportunity to meet this organization, and through this organization share my research with all of you. I also look forward to your comments, your suggestions, and Today, of course, what I'm going to do is specific to this organization, and particularly keeping your interest in literature and English literature in mind. That is how I have framed my presentation on. But of course, at the outset, I should say that I'm a historian basically. And but partition literature, as Dr. Saha has already mentioned, is something which now historians have started taking up as yet another important resource for us to understand what we term as the human dimension of partition. So, though entirely it is the work of literateurs, yet historians have also started utilizing works of literature, but also works of cinematic representations, oral history. This way, we have expanded our archive so that we can get the people's history of partition. And for that, literature is absolutely essential. With that, I'd like to start on my paper, as it is titled and has already been explained. It's describing the traumatic memories of a special, I mean, traumatic memories would be of every refugee in general, but I'm specifically talking about the specific category, the refugee woman. This title was, we can acknowledge it to Dr. Gargi Chakravarti in her very path-breaking book, Coming Out of Partition, the story of the refugee woman. She can be said to be the first to have utilized this term, refugee women. So normally our understanding of the refugee category is a homogeneous category, but to bring out the gender aspect was something which was novel in her contribution. Apart from that, she also looked at a very different image of the refugee women, not only that of victimization, but also of survival. So I'm borrowing this. So what my paper looks at is the aspect of how this refugee woman has been represented in texts coming from Punjab and coming from Bengal. And that is where I'm going to point out the similarities and differences which are there in the partition literature coming from the western side, as I say, and the eastern side, and why certain aspects have been emphasized more on the literature coming from the west and silenced on that side, whereas why there are certain things which are more dominant in the east and silenced over here. That is using through evidences from certain iconic literary works, I would be trying to show this representation. That is what my paper over here is, I propose to do so. I would have started with 2 citations, but perhaps it would be a little too long, but just if I can summarize it, the iconic work of Amrita Pritam and her poem on her, where she is actually asking Varis Shah, if I don't know if you are familiar with this, but Varis Shah is supposed to be the author of this very iconic romantic ballad of Heer Ranjha, and it's also a tragic story, almost like Romeo and Juliet, Indian contemporary of that. Amrita Pritam is beckoning to Varis Shah that you wrote this tragic story for the one single Heer and about her trauma. Now today, when there are so many Heers in Punjab, and she is indicating to the massive number of abductions, abducted women, the women who were raped and who were mutilated, where are you today, and where is their story? The story of these women who were abducted, forcibly married, forcibly converted. There is nobody to write their story. So it's a very moving, and it's in Punjabi, but it has of course been translated in English also, and this kind of sets the tone of the kind of literature Amrita Pritam herself did this poem, and then later by a very grand novel of hers, Pinjar, which perhaps you might be also familiar with a Bollywood movie made on the same theme. So with that, she sets the tone for what is going to come out in partition literature from the West. An image of the woman who was victimized, the abducted woman, the woman who was raped. That is the iconic imagery that is represented in the stories or in the partition literature coming from the West. If we look in the Eastern side, this kind of violence is not the main stress point in the literature coming over here. And I will, of course, explain why it is not the central point. But what then, just like you can cite Amrita Pritam as the iconic imagery, here I would say is there was a very important book by Shaktipada Rajguru, Meghedhata Tara, but became even more iconized when it became a film by Ritvik Khatak as this Meghe Dhaka Tara by the same name. And when Nita, towards the end, is crying in the arms of her brother, Dada Ami Bachte Chai, I want to survive. So that reflects the crux of the story from the East. That will be the dominant theme of survival, of more experiences of post-partition experiences rather than what happens during partition or before partition. That is one noteworthy distinction which one can see in points of emphasis of literature coming from West or literature coming from East. Now, with that, I want to go on to my paper is actually structured around 3 sections. The first looks at the historical context, and I want to explain to you why there are dominant themes which emerge in West and East and why they're different representations. To understand that, we need to understand the historical context of partition and the resultant migration. So first section, I will briefly dwell in that. Second section of my paper looks at the various literary. I will take up some iconic texts which are there, written and translated, of course, in English, for understanding the stories from the West and the East. And the third and last section looks at an analysis of those very texts and what comes out from them, evidences that come out from them, as well as, importantly, I want to point out the silences which are there. So that is how I have structured this paper of mine. And to first then begin with the aspect of historical context of partition. I mean, what made the difference in East or West? At this point, I would of course say that my doctoral thesis, which was based on solid historical archives, looked at this aspect of difference of patterns of migration and also the differing rehabilitation regime which was there for the refugees coming from West and the refugees coming from East. But that is not what I'm going to focus on over here. It is only one part of that which I pick up to explain to you why the context of the partition in West was different from the partition in East. And for that, we need to understand one very important term, that is the aspect of violence. Now, violence was in many ways defined the way people would move out of their homelands, or how partition would affect the partition-related migration and displacement. And that migration and displacement, it is my contention, explains the differing experiences of refugees on both sides. So what was the difference in the violence? Now, as a historian, I would say that there are, and Professor Suranjan Das, he has, his work is, the most iconic example of understanding, analyzing communal violence within the region of Bengal specifically. But that is something which you can expand to whole of India as well, that in colonial times, communal violence, gains a momentum, especially from 1890s. But that is violence which also had a class dimension to it. So it was not altogether Hindus versus Muslims. It could also be something related to Hindu laboring class or Muslim laboring class versus the Hindu merchant class. So there would be a class dimension to it. And that is the pattern of the communal violence all up to 1946 Direct Action Day. Direct Action Day completely changes the direction of communal violence, where now it is not just about communalism, it is now very full-fledged separatism. It is the demand for a separate state, and it is across the classes. So that violence in Direct Action Day, we would all be familiar with, coming from the eastern part, starts, of course, in Calcutta, spreads to Noakhali, goes on to regions in Bihar, United Provinces, but it swells in the whole, it reaches an unprecedented level in Punjab in the month of March. So starting from October 1946 and to March 1947, that is what Gyanendra Pandey calls as the arc of partition violence. And it is this violence which has been the focus of sociologists, anthropologists, and later on literateurs as well, to show how this really impacted partition-related migration on the western side and eastern side. This violence can be broken up into direct violence and what is called by psychologists or anthropologists as soft violence or indirect violence. Direct violence would be murder, rape, mutilation of body parts, forced conversions, whereby it is just simply impossible to stay on. By contrast, you find indirect violence can be seen more as a small nudge and a push, which is happening. And as it would be also called by psychologists as psychological violence. For example, there are certain instances which are cited also in some of the texts where suppose, there are Hindu women going for a bath in the open pond. So lewd comments which are passed. It's not a direct violence, but it is from next day, stop going to bath. Is what the elders would say. You stop going to that pond, or you stop crossing through lane which is quote unquote infested by the other community. Or for example, the oral history, you would find instances that we were not allowed to wear our pola and shaka, or we were not allowed to wear on the vermilion. So it's not something directly on the body, but something, a soft violence which is affecting the psychology or the psyche of the people living in the eastern side. So what one does analyze through archival sources is find that there is more evidence of direct violence in the Punjab region. And it is, to the level of being called as genocidal violence, almost like a Holocaust. Whereas what East saw in October 1946 is tremendous violence. But the presence of Gandhi, as Professor Sumit Sarkar states, it's a golden hour of Mahatma over there. Gandhi's presence ensures that this kind of violence that happened in Punjab is not replicated in Bengal. And it remains so till 1950. So from his presence in 1947, and of course he doesn't stay on till the 50, but that is, as Mountbatten calls, the one-man boundary force, which ensured Bengal remained peaceful, or the eastern borders remained peaceful despite partition and migration from 1947 to 1950. By contrast, what you find in the western side is that Punjab was in flames. And just if you can give me 1 second here. I'm sorry, there was a disturbance here. What I was suggesting, so Punjab is up in flames in 1947, and it is despite a full-fledged army deployment, one cannot control the violence over there. And here on the east, you find Gandhi, his presence, which has quelled the violence for a long time. When you have the first major riots after 1946 in December 1949. So this violence, as I said, soft, but it's violence nonetheless. You still have people who were migrating out in 1946, in 1947, 1948, even from the east. And as analysis shows, it's largely Bhadralok migration at this time. But what is so why are they moving out? Manashik Niporon is the term which Hiranmoy Bandyopadhyay in his memoir uses the term. So it's psychological trauma that suddenly they are not used to seeing some of these actions which I just mentioned, and so they are moving out. The level of uncomfort. So psychologists term this difference direct and indirect violence, and because of which, why I'm emphasizing so much on the violence aspect is this violence is the factor which determines the migration pattern. And on the west, then you have full exchange, what is seen as exchange of population. So all Hindus and Sikhs, they move out from West Pakistan, and they have moved into, it's 97% shift with very small minorities still staying on by 1948 itself. So 1947 to 1948, you already find a full exchange of population. Muslims from what is northern India or northwestern India have also moved out into what is West Pakistan. Bengal, as I said, because of this, what is seen as Hemanti Roy also calls as low-grade violence, you don't find swift movement of all minorities. And in fact, very little movement of minorities from India to East Pakistan. And as I said, it's largely a Bhadralok migration, which is happening from in this period of 46 to 49. But that is also in phases. So it's not a swift migration. It's not a one-time migration. Migration in the East is a phase-wise migration. And in fact, there are peaks like the ebb and flow of tide. And the peak period, of course, 1946, 1949, 50, when you have the first post-independent communal violence over there, which is of a similar level as Punjab had seen in 47. And then 1964, the Hazrat Bal Mosque riots in Kashmir, which sparks a spiraling effect in Bengal. So these are identified, and 1971, of course. These are seen as the high points of migration, but doesn't mean that there has been no migration before that. It's more in trickles, it's more in phases. So violence, which dictated the pattern of migration, and the pattern of migration dictated the response of the state also. So when you have a whole proper exchange of migration, you had a military evacuation organization set up for bringing in refugees or taking the refugees from here to that side, fully state organized, state built, not willingly. I mean, nobody had thought there will be an exchange of population, but it kind of forced itself because of the level of violence. It was understood they just cannot live together. And so you had this full state apparatus, with food caravans, railways, buses, and those who could afford it, even the aircraft. That was also there to bring in people. Whereas for the refugees coming from East, we see that since the level of violence had been, much in control, and what is not counted is the psychological violence, as it is spoken about. That is something which we find that the state is also in a sort of lethargy, or in terms of trying to stop this influx in the East. The state is stopping and trying to, and that is what my entire research has attempted to do, look at the various ways in which there were restrictions put to this influx in East. But even the host society is not so very welcoming. So why? So violence, which affected the pattern of migration, is very dominant in Punjab, and that is the reason why you will find all the short stories, novels, poetry, all kind of compositions are focused just about the gruesome violence that is there. Now for Bengal then, because you did not really see that kind of violence except in the phases that I have mentioned, the more dominating story is about the survival. You had a state which was not very willing to take in the refugees. You had a host society which is also trying to create obstacles and not so welcoming. So then the theme of survival becomes more important. And that is the difference which I found, looking through the official archive, but that is also what I see is reflected in the dominant themes of literature. In the case of Punjab, what is dominant is then stories of women as victims, whereas what we see the stories coming from Bengal is about women who survived, who tried to bring the family together, who, the many women who will become breadwinners for the family. That is the more dominant theory. So violence affects the migration patterns which affected the rehabilitation, response from state, response from host. All of this led to a very differing public memory and public noting of the condition of refugees and what needs to be. So what trickled into public memory, into popular representation of refugee then comes out of this factor. So victimization, gruesome violence, these are the more dominant themes. In Bengal, the themes are then more about that we survived, come what may, we came and we survived. And so that is the brief historical context which I wanted to focus on. Now that brings me to then the second part of this, which is about the evidences that we get from actual literary sources. I have identified the following themes as violence, victimization. These are the two dominant themes. So if we talk about violence, the classic work is of course of Saadat Hasan Manto. one can even read it online. There are translations of it. Siya Hashiya, the black chapters as it is. They range from 2 lines to large full-fledged stories about the gruesome violence that one saw. Now, also important is Manto is so subtle also at the same time, and very pointed in his understanding and description of the violence. It's not only violence which the refugees or the minorities faced from the other. It's not only Hindus versus Muslims and Muslims versus Hindus, but it is what he also described is the violence within the same community. And here I would emphasize on the classic work of a very short story by Manto again, Kholdo, which is about this Sikh woman who is of course abducted and raped by the Muslim community, by her Muslim abductors, and serial over a long phase of time. Then, because the government comes across with a recovery and restoration act, and through which such women were being searched and being, so to say, restored to their families. So in that process, the lady is being now brought back by her own community. In the process, she is again raped by that from her own community. So much is the trauma of this woman that when she is actually, her father is told that we have found, perhaps she is your daughter and she is in this hospital and you can come to see her. She sees her father and she is in so much trauma. She doesn't see it's her father. It's perhaps a male. It's the only thing that comes in her mind. And as they say, Kholdo, so she's literally opening on the tags of her salwar, because she thinks she cannot even differentiate between who is the protector and who is the perpetrator of violence. So very succinctly, the grossness of the violence is there, but at the same time, what is being subtly hinted at, that the violence is not one-sided. There was violence which was both-sided. And in fact, that is a difference in partition violence, that you never had just a victim. You could be victim on one side and you could become the perpetrator of violence on another side. Literature is something which brought this aspect to our notice, and not from the official archives. And that's why literature has been so useful, because the whole debate on recovery and restoration is something which we got first the hint from the literary works. And then historians started looking into, okay, there was an act, and you can start seeing the debates around it. So in terms of violence, that is one, Manto's works are classic in explaining the level of violence, and that the violence is not one-sided, it is from within as well. Train to Pakistan is another iconic text by Khushwant Singh, again describes the whole aspect of violence. And basically, what is very important in that text is the symbol of the train, that we are all familiar with newspaper reportings, and if we are also familiar with oral testimonies, then the images of trains, like being sent as gift to Hindustan or gift to Pakistan, of mutilated bodies, blooded and killed. So that grossness is again reflected. At the same time, you have a woman, a female character over there, and there are attempts to protect her from within your own community and or from within the other community as well. So some elements of good gestures, or what one can say, humanity amidst insanity, that also kind of theme gets reflected. So within the broad range of violence, what does come across are themes of two-sided violence, from outside, from within. At the same time, within, despite a very violent imagery that is there, some elements of humanity amidst this insanity. That kind of stories are also, some of those stories are also reflected over here. The second theme, which is very, very dominant in stories coming from the West, and here, of course, where I am referring to are the anthologies edited by Professor Alok Bhalla. In fact, he came across with 4 volumes on stories about partition. He has tried to collect stories all across, from all different languages, and translated and put them on these 4 volumes. But of course, the larger number of stories are the stories from Punjab. So in that, if one goes through those stories as well and sees instances from that, or you even read individually, as I was mentioning, I started with Amrita Pritam. So maybe her work Pinjar, that is another cult, short, no, a cult work or cult partition literature, which you can see talks about victimization. So there are people who are talking about, violence and how many killed and how women were attacked, this, that. But what happens to that woman who has been attacked? What happens to the woman who has been abducted? What is her story? That comes across best in Pinjar, the novel, where you can see Amrita Pritam takes it in a very sensitive manner. Here is this Hindu woman who has been abducted, and she's forced to live with this Muslim man. Somehow she manages to escape from that, and when she comes back to her own family is resistant to taking her, keeping her now, because of this concept of defiling. Supposedly she is now defiled, not pure enough, not to be taken back. This is something which Gandhi and Nehru are all requesting, these families. You must be taking, you should take back these women, they are pure, this, that. But this story revolves around that. So she is not taken by her own family. Very subtle hints being dropped that you are not welcome here. And she goes back to her abductor's family. So, the psychology of that refugee woman, is also being in a very subtle manner being talked about. That this is one more theme that then comes across. And Pinjar is one story, but likewise Rajendra Singh Bedi and his short story Lajwanti is another example of this abducted woman. Where abducted woman is the center stage. So she was abducted, but she and her husband has been an activist, bring back the women, bring back the women. But when his own wife is now recovered and restored to him, he starts treating her differently, not in the same way that she was first. In fact, the first he was there are stories of domestic abuse that she remembers. Husband was very rude to her, but now he is sort of respectful to her, like a saintly and motherly, godly. That's how he started seeing her. So how the woman is then feeling that she is really out of place. Even if my husband has accepted me, he's not accepting me the way it was. So violence and this sort of victimization from which the women feel, for no fault of theirs, but they are being victimized by their own family, are the kind of themes which come across in literature. But if you see in terms of survival stories, that, not if we remove this aspect of violence and victimization, something which is not found in these stories is of the woman who survived, or of the woman who did something for, bringing up the family, which now I'll be discussing the stories from the eastern side, and you will get to know. Those are stories which are not found when we are talking about the stories coming from West. You take any example of stories from literature in Punjabi, in Urdu, and I'm of course reading translated works only, but they're all talking about either description of violence or the level of victimization of this abducted woman. If we come to the Eastern case, and of course you would be familiar with many of these works, I want to take the example of the very iconic Epar Ganga, Opar Ganga by Jyotirmoy Devi. This book, if you see, the whole violence is something which is not mentioned. I mean, very in the initial period, it would just be described that yes, the Muslims attacked Sutara and her family, and maybe a mother and sister. They were raped and they were killed. Very briefly mentioned, but that is not the focus. The focus is of Sutara, who was kept then in the who was saved by her Muslim neighbors, stayed there for some time, and then when she came back, she is also rejected by her own brother and brother's family. And then how she goes on to Delhi. In fact, this is the one novel which has somewhere linked the East and West story. She sees abducted and similar refugee women from Punjab. And so that is a very interesting chapter. One of the only book which actually discusses some link between the East and West partition. But so that is the larger focus of the story of Sutara, what she's thinking about her not being accepted in the family, but also the fact that she goes on to study and becomes a lecturer, and she's basically standing on her own. So there is element of violence, but that is not the main focus of the story. The violence is of a different kind, which Jyotirmoy Devi is talking about, as she calls it, Stree Palva, that this is something which is not written about the women's chapter, which how they are, in silence, they have been violated, and that, soft violence, once again, that is something which is more dominant in the stories from the eastern side. Another account, if one takes about, when we are talking about this violence in the east, would be the very two very thick volume book Purva Paschim, Sunil Gangopadhyay, when he East West. Now there are multiple levels of violence which are discussed over there, of the family which gets displaced. It comes over here again, very little of that description why they are coming here, but more emphasis is on his struggles of Pratap when he is in Kolkata city, whether it is with his parents, whether it's with the problem that his sister sees. That violence has been discussed even in greater, of squatter families occupying the land, and then her husband dying, the sister's husband dying, and the sister now becoming extra quote unquote burden on Pratap, and how she is still trying to survive with her pieces of gold. So what is the main focus of stories from the East, if you find? And Devjani Sengupta, of course, came across with anthology and collection of all these short stories also. In all those stories, you will find if the refugee woman is seen more as a character of somebody who has, seen violence, but that is in the background. The more important thing is of how she is standing up and becoming the breadwinner of the family. And this is, of course, iconized in the cult book Meghadhata Tara, which of course we know more familiar with because of Ritvik Ghatak's film. So the focus in East has always been of these Nitas, the women who stood up and who could become the breadwinners of their family. Another theme which comes across when we talk about the stories in coming from East is of the nostalgia for the home which has been lost. Because now, you see, violence is not such an important, overbearing thing in East. It's not the dominant image in public memory, apart from, those incidents in 50 and 64. And it's not seen the kind of violence which Punjab has seen. So then what comes up across in partition literature in East? It's more about then this emerging of the refugee women, as Pallavi Chakravarti calls, coming out of partition. Or the second theme which I found is of nostalgia for the lost homeland. A classic work would be, of course, Dakshina Ranjan Basu edited Chede Ashadgram. And if you have read that, you will see of all the districts of East Bengal, each of them, one author writing something about it. And it's all good, all we had a good relation with between Hindus and Muslims. And the description is more of the geography, the rivers flowing by, and the green tree, the greenness that was there, and very good relations. All that is more important. And everything, this violence is then just either a one line mention over there. It's seen as an anomaly. It's not something normal. So violence takes a backseat in the stories coming from East, and violence is the centerpiece when you're looking at the literature coming from West. Nostalgia is something which is more dominant here, and the image of the survival woman. And when we are looking at the situation from West, then it is more about violence and victimization. And there could be more references that I could give from the texts of this literature in the East and the West. But I think I want to move now to the third section, which is about the silences that are there in literatures on both sides. How do we get to know about these silences, and what is missing? So as I just gave you the context that yes, violence was the dominant aspect in West, and no doubt then it it dominates the public memory, and it will be most dominant and explained to you. It will be the larger theme in the text. But what about the caste aspect, for example? And this we just stumbled upon by one single interview in The Other Side of Violence by Urvashi Butalia, that there was a so-called lower caste woman who told that partition for us was a very nice period. We were not harmed, we were untouched, because we were not considered Hindus, so we were not worth being killed. So, but that somehow doesn't, this is there in oral history, and even in the official records, which I have also seen, there's a whole exchange between government of India and government of Pakistan about how to bring back the Harijans from West Pakistan and their evacuation, whereas Pakistan doesn't want them to leave because they are important for cleaning up the roads which are filled with dead bodies and vultures, etc. In fact, they go on to put the ESMA, the Essential Services Maintenance Act, and they don't want the Harijans to leave. But somehow this has not come across in the literature that we see. Mostly the literature is about the so-called upper castes and their experiences of partition. So caste is something which is missing in Punjab. Interestingly, it is only now coming up in a big way from in the eastern side. So Adhir Vishwas, Manoranjan Vyapari, their autobiographies, Chaturth Dunya with its many publications, they are coming up with experiences, and finally caste has become important in the caste, and their experiences of partition has started coming up in the Bengal side. And of course now historians, so Shekhar Bandyopadhyay and Anushuva Basuroy Chaudhary, they are all, Uditi Sen, they are all working on the caste aspect, but only very recently it has started emerging in the literature. So that is one important silence, which is somehow it has escaped the works of partition literature. The other thing is about the other community. Now I'm talking from India's perspective. So the other over here is becoming the Muslim. Very little voices of Muslim and their experiences actually come from this side that we find. So when especially what I'm pointing out to is of the Muslim woman who decided to stay back, who stayed on. For example, and of course on the eastern side, a very important major work is of course Hassan Azizul Haq and Agun Pakhi, and it's just tremendous, and to see the kind of agency that finally the Muslim woman is expressing, of that she is not going to go and she will stay back. But these are some very rare examples. Somehow, if you see legal cases, Citizenship Act, and official archive, will still have little bit more example of those women who chose not to go and they stayed on over here. Somehow literature has escaped that aspect also. And one more thing that I find that partition literature, perhaps there would be stories I may not have come across, but somewhere it's not there in the very dominant collections that are there so far, is how women themselves then envisioned their role in partition and post-partition. What were their images that they come up with? In the Punjab side especially, there are autobiographies by social workers. Anis Kidwai came with a very important, in Freedom's Shade, that's the English translation, but Azadi Ki Chhaw Mein. Likewise, Kamla Behan Patel, she came across with her memoir as somebody working with recovery and abducted women restoration process. But you find that these are very few and far between. So very little that comes of the women and their vision of what they saw their role in post-partition and post-independence state. Here also we find one very nice writing on the refugee woman of Bengal is of course Take a Girl Like Her by Ashok Mitra. When he is talking about where is the life in this girl and what are her wishes, what are her desires, what is there that she herself wants for herself. So I would say that some of these are themes which are very either very less mentioned, or these are some silences which we need to again find out through oral history. And nowadays you have a lot of recordings of people, partition survivors. 1947 Partition Archive, for example, has very good recordings and of largest number of people. And I also had the good fortune of going through those testimonies. So in their memory, somehow I find that you can get some of these silences do get answered. Perhaps there has it's not so much reflected when we see the partition literature as such. So in all, what I see that partition literature has been very useful for the historians and for many of us working on partition, because many, as I say, they're the human dimension. What historians have looked at is the cause, course, and consequence of why partition happened. But what is the actual meaning of partition? That it meant, for example, Gyan Pandey and Vashya Butalia very vociferously say that partition meant violence, nothing else. So it is just violence. But of course, that is with Punjab in mind. If we think about Bengal, then maybe in addition to violence, there would be also other things about survival and nostalgia, which would be common even in Punjab. So, but somehow the dominant memory is of violence. But overall, what is partition literature? It has pointed us towards very important, things, questions that so far had been overlooked. Like I said, recovery of abducted persons. I mean, this was something which we only came across through through the literary works, and then we started looking into the official archive. Likewise, as historians say, first it is indescribable violence. We cannot describe. So what we cannot describe, then we rely on the techniques of literature. That perhaps we have a literary license then to explore the violence or the experience in more true, authentic terms. So pointing towards newer themes, pointing towards which is already existing and actually explaining to us what partition meant. In that way, partition literature has really helped us a lot in literary works on partition, in addition to, of course, cinematic representations and oral history. Our whole understanding of partition studies, if we can call, has really expanded because of all this. I can end at that, and I hope I'm on time. Yeah, that is from my end.
Hello, Nitu ma'am. Are you there? Nitu Gupta ma'am. Thank you so much, Pallavi ma'am, for such a very wonderful and interesting deliberation. There are so many comments on the chat box. People are congratulating you for such a wonderful deliberation. Nitu Gupta ma'am, are you there?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, ma'am, please, it's over to you now.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for this wonderful, enlightening, and insightful speak on partition memories, East-West story that ma'am has told. Ma'am, I'd like to add a few observations and questions that the participants have put up, those who are here. Some Broken Kulam by Atia Hussain and What the Body. These are the texts, I believe. Yes, I remember Baldwin and Ice Candy Man by Sidwar are other major works on partition. I mean, there are so many works of partition, on partition. And I also would like to mention Salman Rushdie's Midnight's Children. That was such a wonderful text, complicated text, though it may be. This is just an observation, ma'am. These are all works on partition and how we look into the entire process and the political decision that has taken place during that time. Would you like to say something, ma'am?
Which one should I answer, the chat question?
Ma'am, if you want to. This is an
So I think these are, these are, yes, I agree. There are, of course, partition literature is very dense. It is, and to talk on both sides, it is even difficult to put it all in one single talk. But yes, of course, these are very noted works which you have mentioned, as well as I can see on the chat box also.
Yes, Professor Minal Srivastav has put up this observation for you.
Yeah, I get those. Absolutely, I've gone through these works as well, and yeah, that is, that points out to. They are very important works, no doubt.
There are innumerable works, I believe, and many autobiographical writings.
Absolutely. I would like to and thank you for all those who are also congratulating me. Thank you very much. I would like to take about this partition literature about love between two communities. Absolutely, and very important point. Yes, that is one also theme which is there in many of these stories, specifically Intizar Hassan. To my mind immediately, which is coming across is, his short story, Chronicle of Peacocks, which is coming immediately to my mind. But yeah, there are these works which talk about the love between two communities. Even on the eastern side, I have read short stories which, and I think I just hinted a bit about that, where I said that there is works as in Train to Pakistan also, humanity amidst insanity are themes as well, which partition literature covers. So yes, just as you see violence, you also see about how people of the opposite community even try to protect you and defend you, and there are stories on both east and west which are covered on this.
Tales of love, tales of hatred, all together. How it is incorporated.
Yes. So there are works on that. Yeah.
Yes, Mukesh Kumar Shukla. For this question, there is one more observation or question. The trauma of partition, it hinges on the psychological migration, the sense of being cannibalized to a set of experiences that the soul only abhors. This is, I believe, it is an observation by Arun Mukherjee.
Yes. So I don't think it's a question. So I did not. I think it's a very. I think it's a comment, right? So I take that.
Yes.
I really thank you for all these very encouraging comments. Thank you so much. So I'm actually just reading the chats. Yeah, so that's why.
Okay, ma'am. I think you are going through the chats and questions you have seen, the observations.
I'm not finding any question. They are very, very encouraging comments, and so kind of you for encouraging me. Thank you.
In fact, indeed, it was the lecture. Throwing light into how East and West, and what I thought would be the East Punjab or West Punjab, that sort of analysis. But it was so nice that it was from Bengal and Punjab.
Yeah.
Earlier, what I assumed was this concept.
Okay. All right. No, the partition in the East and West Punjab wouldn't have any differing as such stories. Only the victim and the aggressor would be interchanged. No?
Exactly.
But the real demarcation would be between Punjab and Bengal because of the, as I said, different historical context and partition, what different impact that it had. So I thought that would be a little interesting to.
Yes, and ma'am, as you can already see in the chat box, the observations from the participants, how intriguing was your lecture and how we all have enjoyed.
I think there is a question, right?
Let me see.
Yes, ma'am. There are questions from Anupama, ma'am.
Yes.
From Anupama Vora, ma'am, there is a question.
Partition after 75 years is not only about hatred and trauma, but about regret and remorse. But still, cultural memory remains unresolved. How do you look into this, the present time, and 25 years from? Ma'am, to you.
Yeah, I'm just reading. Actually, may I request you to explain the question to me, because I'm not.
And the question is, a partition after 75 years is not only about hatred and trauma, but regret, remorse, but still cultural memory remains unresolved. So how do you look into it in the present time and 25 years from?
No, I can read that question. What I'm not getting is what is this cultural memory aspect which is remaining unresolved? I do not get that. If Dr. Vohra could perhaps
Mohra
explain
ma'am, if
that.
you are here, if you can personally put up the question.
Am I audible now?
Yes, yes, yes. Please go ahead. And apologies for not
See,
being able to understand.
let me congratulate you, Pallavi, for a very
Yes, yes.
informative, for a very insightful talk. I really enjoyed,
Thank you.
and I have a personal connect with Partition also, because I also come from the second generation of Partition survivors. My parents moved from Zafrabad in POK to Jammu. What I really wanted to know from you is that when we look at Partition, right, 75 years in the present time, the narrative to a certain extent has changed. What it was in the 60s and the 70s, the trauma, the hatred, it remains there, no doubt. But along with the trauma and the hatred, one uh, thing which came up earlier was also of love. And somewhere you have this talk about regret also, about remorse also, coming from the writings from both sides and also in the informal discussions also. But the culture memory, what actually happened during partition, the hatred also, how people were there to kill each other, and then people who were living together, they became overnight, they became enemies to each other. And those have trickled down in the present time also. So, keeping all this in mind, how do you look at the partition, this talk, this discourse about partition? That what will actually, will it take a different turn in the coming 25 years when we'll be completing 100 years of our independence and also 100 years of our division of the country?
Right. Very, very useful question and something to really think about. And I will give an instance over here. So it that doesn't come from literary works, because very recently I haven't read anything of present times in partition literature. I mean, what all the examples I've given you are almost contemporaneous at that time and written almost at the same time. But oral history gives some indication of your question, and especially I here would refer to very good collection by Anam Zakaria. She has compared, the book is on 1971, that shows that some memories just don't change. So she, being a Pakistani, when she goes to Bangladesh after so many years, she is still seen as a Pakistani. And it's so many it's so many years passed, and as she points out very poignantly, I was not even born in 1971, and yet there are accusatory fingers pointed out towards me in Bangladesh, when she has a very hostile reception over there. So I think that somewhere memories do remain, which which do affect our at least in the first and second generations. One would see this kind of very indelible mark that the memory has left behind. Success to succeeding generations, perhaps it starts to change. As again, if I cite Zakaria's work, she said that when she went to school, she's a school teacher basically, but she went to interact with the children. The children were very inquisitive, and Bangladesh story is only 25 years so far, but those children are taking up to her more positively, and so I think with later generations, maybe somewhere there's a trickling down, and contemporary realities are more important. But at the same time, politicization is another thing. And what in historical terms we say, when you are recreating this
Thank you, ma'am. Can I take up the next question?
Hello, Pallavi ma'am. Hello.
Can I take up the next question?
I think Pallavi ma'am is having some network issues.
Right. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Hello, Pallavi
The
ma'am. Are you
specter of-
there? Yeah. She is there.
It got disconnected actually. Sorry for
Okay.
that. There was a power cut. So I was saying that the specter of partition, that is something which we think that keeps being brought back to our, even if we are trying to forget, it keeps coming back to us. And their politics helps. I mean, that's what the role of politics is, to keep bringing it back into our minds. So how many that as very common thing that Muslims go to Pakistan in present generation, or there are some recent anthropological works, for example, in Banaras, which talks of these tunnels, or contemporary works in Delhi, for example, Zakia Nagar is seen as mini Pakistan. So in today's time, if you're talking about mini Pakistans or surangs, as they say in Banaras, leading up to Pakistan, so I think politics also plays some role to keep certain things, specters of partition alive. I don't know if that explains. Right? Okay.
Very well explained. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am.
Very well.
Thank you, ma'am. There is another question Pankaj Gupta wants to put forward. He asks that, was it partition resulted in violence, or was it violence that has resulted to partition?
Yeah, no, this is a historical question, and it requires a large, big answer actually. So, as I said, that communal violence, it took time from the 1940s to become into what is seen as, we see it as a tracing of, first is community consciousness, through all these, for example, Brahmo Samaj and all these social reform movements, they caused communal consciousness. That was harmless. Then it became in the 1890s communalism, and where it is Hindus versus Muslims and British divide and rule politics. But when it became separatism from the 1940s, it is globally accepted. Then there was no looking back. So partition became inevitable at that time. So it's in some way violence also affected. It just became difficult to stay on, to live together. And at the same time, we must not forget, as it is said, the elephant in the room is the British, who sowed the seeds of divide. So I would say that either way is violence also, and then partition by 1940s, we are sure moving towards separatism. Right.
Thank you very much, ma'am. Thank you very much.
Yes, I mean this
Hello.
little,
Very well said.
Right.
these
Hello,
little,
Yeah.
little violences were turned into a humongous violence by the Britishers. Anyway, let's come to the next question. Next question by Lala Saheb Patil. Do you think that the conflict would be resolved in future, or great literary narratives offer a solution? A very dicey question.
Yeah,
Has it-
I don't think I'm actually capable of answering that. I mean, about literature, I can only say that there's a lot of hope that is there in some of the stories, and there's a lot of remorse also, that why Pakistan, why did we have the divide, why did we have partition. But future, I don't think nothing coming to my mind from the literary texts which points towards future. And as historian, we don't look to the future, we look into the past. And, we can't be talking about it. So I would say that there are partition literature of hope that is there. There are stories of hope. There is stories of regret, why the divide happened. But I don't think that any work you can suggest would be talking about future.
Thank you,
Any
ma'am.
solution, I'm not aware of this work. I'm sorry,
Mahesh,
Sir
the
Prashant,
time is
sir. I am not aware of this work. So, is this a book, or Prashant, sir? Is this a book? the story?
Yes. Prashant sir? Prashant sir? I think not audible.
Yes,
I'm
ma'am.
sorry.
Final Solution is a book written by Mahesh Dattani.
Okay, I'm sorry, I'm not aware of this. And it's on Partition. I've noted this down. I think I will read it. That's what I can
Okay,
say.
ma'am. Nothing to worry.
Yeah.
Anita, ma'am, please go forward.
Yes. These are the questions and observations from the participants. And most of the participants have thanked you, ma'am, Pallavi, ma'am, we as a whole, for such an insightful, talk today on partition and looking from the east to west perspective. Thank you so much, ma'am, for the today's lecture.
Yeah, I would like to thank you all for this very encouraging comments and useful suggestions also. And it was a pleasure to meet all and read about this and speak among all literateurs. So thank you for wholeheartedly welcoming me also. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Now moving forward, let me now introduce our chairperson for today's session, Dr. Shrikirti sir, Associate Professor, Department of English, Bangalore University. He has done his MA and PhD from the University of Mysore, and he has an experience of teaching of more than 22 years, and his current interest is on post-colonialism, digital literature, and critical theory. He has also completed a project under Bangalore University. Can I now invite Shrikirti sir, our chairperson for today, to give his opinion and critical comments on the lecture.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for giving me at first. I know I have to thank the speaker of today, Dr. Chakravarty, for a very structural and insightful revelation of the history and the history-connected literary works. It provided, with a structural way, both the connection of the East and the West, and very specifically commenting on the particular idea of violence as well as the women representation. Indeed, in considering to study history, and very specifically this given period of partition, it's a very complex event or a complex historical period where it is not just consumed or connected with one particular event, but it has several pasts to be considered from the Foucault's idea that it has several pasts, several forms of connections and several hierarchies of importance, where in which we have the history of politics, history of culture, history of society, and very specifically when we look into the literary works, we find the history of emotions also. In which, in dealing with history, we won't come across the emotions and the relationships between the individual and between two nations, but it is much found recorded in the literary works. And considering these literary works to explore the history, it gives lots of networks of determinations and lots of teleologies also to understand the history of partition in a better way. And in that way, whatever you have talked about has provided us a very good connection between history and literature, and very specifically looking into the idea of violence and the identity of women and the emotions of the women characters. Indeed, these are not found in history in the recorded form, but we find in literature these kind of records. So in one way, history is providing some understanding towards the history, and literature is providing some understanding towards the history, and history is providing some content and some ideas to develop the narrative in the form of literature. So they are complementary to each other. And in this context, in this iSPELL forum, which is getting into the forum of discourse, we find today how history can be utilized in understanding and interpreting literature, and as well as how literature is being used by history also to understand it in a better way. And in that way, I really congratulate and I appreciate your concern and the way you delivered the lecture to make everyone to understand the connection between literature and history. And one more thing to reveal or discuss at this point with a professor asking, I think Anupama madam was asking, what would be the future of this partition literature in 25 years? To consider this idea, what would be the partition literature in 25 years of future means. I remember at this point, Zizek talking about Holocaust literature and even the Holocaust itself, because in the moment of the time, going away from the real historical point, our understanding of history, our consideration of history would be very feeble. It becomes very thin, and the distinction between the history and the literature, history and the narrative would be very thin. So we would be coming out with more of exaggeration or more of fantasies of the history rather than the reality, because one generation which is very much closely connected with the history of partition is almost all vanished. And whatever we find, the record of the history is through the writings and through certain memories. When that generation is over, our consideration of the history of the same period is going to be much fictionalized rather than the historicity. So that is where we find the problem in the future, if at all, if it is considered considered to be continuing the narratives of partition literature, in the words of what Zizek says, Holocaust as a joke, that would be the situation. I think that the partition literature would be a joke in the future for the future generation, because understanding of the history without understanding the several past of that particular period, several forms of connection of that particular period, would be not a very strong idea of history. And it is these kind of discourses, utilizing history, utilizing literature, and coming across with lots of past that the period has consisting, or period has experienced. We won't be able to keep the history in the real historical form. So history is going to be feeble if it is not to be considered to interpret in a structural and in a relevant way. So even the literature produced also in the future, or the studies going to be considered in the future, would not be so serious as it is happened, or as really the history is. So there's a problem for us in understanding history as and when we go on in the time, we continue in the time, because our understanding of history is much through the lens of the present rather than with the conditions of the past. We understand history through the lens of the present, and we try to interpret everything. To have an example at this point, if again, after 20 years, a film is produced, for example, on the basis of partition history, it would be produced on the materialistic understanding of that period rather than of the historical period. So the understanding of that history of the generation is through the material conditions of the present rather than of the past. So it is killing the imaginary capacities also of the viewers or of the readers. So we face a very difficult problem in understanding the history as we go in the future, as we go to the future. So considering literature, either literature or history in the future, it always depends on what we construct the discourse at this point and what we provide the discourse to the next generation is one constructive attempt to keep the history alive. Otherwise, history is going to be fictionalized very much. And this is where we have the pitfall of misunderstanding history. Because generally, history is one kind of map where we always misread. History is a place of misreading. And always coming across with the either political influences or the political ideologies, history can be manipulated also, which is at present we are facing in what are all the aspects. History is being manipulated and being established as a new ideology also. So it is with these kind of discourses on this kind of forum, we could provide a better understanding of any disciplines to make the future generation to understand the real thing, the realities of the disciplines. So that in that manner, I really congratulate and I really appreciate the way this iSPELL forum is working towards in constructing and providing a discourse on various subjects. And once again, I thank Dr. Chakravarty for an insightful presentation. And indeed, it is a good time also to have the knowledge of history and this connection with the literature at this point. And thank you for everyone. And it was good questions also I came across. And it was a very good discussion that we had this evening. Over to you, Dr. Neet.
Thank you, sir. So well said and expressed, sir, and have extended your idea on partition and how it may influence when the narrative goes on for years and years. And at the same time, the very thin line that, as sir, you have said regarding history and fiction, a very thin boundary line, which is very dicey and not, fixed. Who decides and how can we decide fiction and history and interrelationship? And there can be innumerable other topics and critical observations on this traumatic history that we had, and probably that impact or influence in whatever ways, I don't think it can be taken back. But yes, as sir has said, there will be different ways of expressing through history or through literature, through memoirs, through life writings, through travel writing, and so on. Anyway, sir, thank you so much. Thank you for the observation. Thanks to our chairperson, Dr. Chakravarty, sir. Now I would like to request our Anupama Vora ma'am, the president of iSPELL, to present the certificates. Ma'am.
Yes, Pramod, can we have the certificates? Thank you, Dr. Chakravarty. Listening to your talk has been very insightful. It has opened up new avenues on further research, not only on literature, but an interdisciplinary research on history and literature. And we also look forward to having you in future also on the iSPELL platform. And we feel very honored to present you this certificate.
Thank you, ma'am, and thank you so
much. On the
much.
occasion of the 85th Sunday Sahitik Satsang. Thank you for sparing your time to be here with us and giving us a very thoughtful talk. Pramod, can we have the next certificate, please? We are equally honored in presenting the certificate for being the chairperson. The talk was insightful and the way you concluded has been fabulous. Thank you, Dr. Srikirti, for accepting the invitation to be the chairperson and giving us remarkable concluding remarks. Thank you, sir. Dr. Neetu Kumari Gupta, you had been the Master of Ceremonies. You conducted the Sunday Sahityik Satsang in an excellent manner, and we are equally honored in presenting you this certificate. Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am.
And before we conclude, we all look forward to have you with us on this virtual platform on next Sunday with another topic related to partition, the homeland. And
Thank you,
now to
ma'am.
you, Neetu, for the formal vote of thanks before we conclude.
Thank you, Bohra ma'am. Thank you so much. Every good session has come to an end, and so is this session on partition and history, going through literature and its impact. However, I would like to extend my thanks to all the people who have made this session so engaging and interesting as well. So the foremost for today's session is our speaker, our very speaker, Dr. Pallavi Chakravarti ma'am. I extend an heartiest thankfulness to you for your insightful reading on the topic of partition and its repercussions. Thank you so much, ma'am. Next, I would like to thank our chairperson for today, Dr. Chakravarty sir, for his critical observation on the topic and giving us other ways of looking into partition and traumatic experiences and other texts, and most importantly, from the theoretical point of view, as sir has already suggested. Thank you so much, sir, for being the chairperson for today and making this session so engaging and interesting. And of course, the special mention must be made to Ghanshyam sir, who has been the General Secretary from the very beginning, and he is the architect behind this vision to facilitate such resourceful sessions and making our even the holidays so engaging and insightful. Thank you so much, sir. I would also like to extend my thanks to our president, vice president ma'am, iSPELL forum, Anupama Bohra ma'am, who is continuously putting up to put every session so that everything is there on time and looking into all the things happening. Thank you so much. Thank you, Bohra ma'am. Special thanks to Prashant Chakravarty sir, who is the mastermind and has designed today's session and is a wonderful teacher, as I have been told and we have been conveyed. Thank you so much, sir, and guiding me specially how I should proceed with my work today. Thank you so much. And a most special thanks to Somali Shaha ma'am, who has been consistently a support, and whatever I had to ask, she was always there for us. And the event coordinator, who has coordinated everything on time and so well organized. Thank you so much. And she is also the vice president of iSPELL Tripura Forum. I also extend my thanks to IT coordinator Pramod Dengle, who has organized and has said the things before time and has led us that we also need to work and put up the session in the most engaging way. Thank you so much. And of course, a special mention for the participants, obviously, without whom the entire session would not have been possible, who have been there listening to the speaker and chairperson and also giving their questions and observations. So nice to have such an engaging sessions to all the iSPELlians who have been devoting an hour on this holiday and a Labor Day. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for such an engaging sessions, and we look forward for a few more sessions in the days ahead. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Gupta.